April 8th, 1945. It was almost over. In Berlin, inside a quiet office, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris was alone, facing a heavy decision that would mark his last moments. He had top-secret information in his hands, the same data that had landed on his desk 2 years prior. The numbers hadn't changed. The truth was still there, staring him in the face. But the world around him had. The question wasn't whether he believed the report anymore. It was whether he had the strength to say it out loud, knowing that in the Third Reich, telling the truth was now an act of betrayal. This is the story of a guy who knew what needed to be said, knew what it would cost him, and still chose to say it. March 17th, 1943. That was the day Admiral Canaris first saw the report about Willow Run. He never forgot that date. It stayed with him through the rest of the war, like a ghost, a truth he couldn't shake off, no matter how busy he was. At first, the numbers shocked him. One bomber coming off the line every hour, 24 a day, from just one factory. But shock turned into something worse, certainty. He became sure that he alone, among the top German military leaders, really understood what those numbers meant. Germany was doomed. But knowing something and being able to do something about it were two different things in Nazi Germany. Canaris understood this all too well. He was 59 now, an admiral in the German Navy, and had been head of military intelligence since 1935. He'd been walking a tightrope in Hitler's government for 10 years. He'd learned how to survive in a system that cared more about ideology than reality. He knew which truths you could whisper and which ones would get you killed. The Willow Run report was definitely in the latter category. When he first showed the report to Goering, the guy just laughed. Americans can't build planes, he scoffed. They're good at making refrigerators and razors. That told Canaris everything he needed to know about how willing the Nazi leaders were to listen to facts they didn't like. He'd heard that laugh before, that arrogant dismissal from people who were so blinded by their beliefs that they couldn't see the truth anymore. But he tried anyway. Throughout 1943 and 1944, his intelligence network kept digging. More agents backed up the production numbers. Even Japanese naval officers, Germany's allies, sent back reports about American industry that sounded almost apologetic, like they were embarrassed to be the bearers of bad news. Every new piece of information just confirmed what he already knew. The math was clear. Germany was going to lose. It was like snow piling up on a mountain, waiting for the moment when the weight would cause an avalanche. But Canaris kept the full story to himself. He wasn't completely silent. He was too honest for that. But he was careful. He told certain officers. He wrote reports that showed the facts, but stopped short of saying what they really meant. He did what he could as a military officer in a dictatorship. He gave correct information to those who would listen, while also protecting himself from being called a defeatist. He was stuck between two things, his duty to tell the truth and his instinct to stay alive. It was a tricky balancing act, and it worked for a while. Canaris survived, while other people who spoke too openly didn't. Some of his fellow workers who had been too blunt ended up getting transferred, demoted, or worse. He kept his job, his power, and his life. But as 1944 turned into 1945 and the Red Army got closer from the east, while American and British troops came from the west, Canaris realized that his careful balance was falling apart. The world was changing fast. The government was dying, and the rules that had kept him alive for so long didn't matter anymore. He started to notice something troubling. The people around him were getting more desperate, not less. As they lost more battles, Hitler became even more sure of victory. As the intelligence reports got worse, the government became stricter, more demanding, and more willing to punish anyone who didn't show complete faith. It was like the Nazi leaders had gone crazy, where reality and belief had flipped. The worse things got, the more they held on to the idea that they were going to win. By early 1945, it was impossible to pretend anymore. Germany was being crushed. Soviet troops had freed Poland and were now inside Germany, heading straight for Berlin. American troops had crossed the Rhine and were taking over the industrial areas. The German Air Force was basically gone. The German army was being destroyed by enemies who had way more industry and resources, just like Canaris had said 2 years ago, when no one listened. The prediction that had seemed impossible back then was now happening, and it was terrible. Even worse, people were starting to pay attention to his warnings. The reports he had written so carefully, trying to soften the language, had been noticed, and they were being seen as signs of defeatism. In Hitler's twisted world, being realistic was getting more and more risky. The government was in its final, desperate days, and that desperation was making it even more stubborn. It was looking for people to blame, for traitors, trying to blame outside forces and internal enemies for problems that were really due to the fact that the math didn't add up. Canaris knew what was happening. He'd seen it before in others. First, they would give correct warnings through the proper channels. Then, they would be ignored. You're overestimating the enemy. Then, they would be suspected. Why are you spreading this defeatist talk? And finally, they would be accused. You're working against the Führer. He could see his own future in the stories of other officers who had been too honest. Canaris had friends outside of military intelligence. He had used his position to protect people in the German resistance, including the theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He had worked to keep Spain out of the war, which had cost Hitler a lot in resources and political power. He had done what he could within the limits of working in the Nazi system to reduce the damage the government could do. He thought about these things now, not with happiness, but with a growing sense that his resistance hadn't been enough. But the SS had noticed his actions. They were watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. And they found one after the failed attempt to kill Hitler on July 20th, 1944. German officers, men of honor and morals, had tried to kill the Führer. The plan had failed. The Gestapo investigation that followed was brutal and thorough. It uncovered a huge network of resistance, and many of the clues led back to Canaris's organization. Many clues led back to Canaris himself. He had been arrested in 1944, but not killed right away. Strangely, he had been held, investigated, and moved from one place to another as the government itself started to fall apart. The government's final collapse had happened faster than even Canaris had thought it would. And now, in these last days of April 1945, with Soviet forces already in Berlin and Hitler getting ready for his final act in the bunker, Canaris was in a camp. He had been moved from prison to prison as the system broke down into total mess. But before the end came, and Canaris knew the end was coming for him, he had to face a question that had been haunting him for 2 years. It was plain but important. Should he tell the whole truth about what he had known? Should he finally say, without holding back or using careful language, what the Willow Run report had really meant? Should he tell the story of how the leaders had refused to accept the truth in the time he had left? Should he break his silence, even if it couldn't change anything, but might at least be a record for history? The answer didn't depend on what was happening around him, but on something inside him. Canaris had spent his entire career being careful about survival. He was a professional intelligence officer, trained to judge risk, to weigh the odds, to protect himself and his job. That training had kept him alive through 10 years of Nazi rule, when so many others had died. But those decisions had also cost him something he was only now starting to understand: his integrity as a person. As April 1945 became his last month, Canaris began to realize that survival came at a price. The price was silence. The price was letting the lie continue. The price he paid was witnessing an administration built on what they believed, ignore the facts, even as they were collapsing. And he never really spelled out what that meant. Every time he softened his words, he helped keep alive a system that valued belief over what was real. Each report he toned down to avoid being called a defeatist was a little stab at the honesty he valued. Canaris always based things on facts. Facts were, in a way, what he believed in most. His job was to find the truth in all the lies, to pick out the important information from the useless noise, to see things as they really were and not just how people wanted them to be. He based his whole career on the idea that accurate info was important, that it was worth something, that it could make a change. But what good was it if he didn't say it out loud? What good was knowing the truth if he just kept it to himself, wrapped it up nicely, and softened it with fancy words so he wouldn't get in trouble, instead of helping people understand? He thought about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a religious thinker he had tried to protect. Bonhoeffer had written about how staying quiet when you see something wrong actually makes you part of the problem. Canaris had read those words when they were being passed secretly from person to person. At the time, they just seemed like the thoughts of a holy man who didn't understand how power really worked. Now, as he was about to die, Canaris wondered if maybe Bonhoeffer had understood something he hadn't. In his last days at Flossenburg, Canaris decided what to do. He wasn't going to write reports or give careful briefings or talk to people who could use the info. He was going to speak straight to those who would listen, the other prisoners who knew what was happening, and to history itself, knowing that one day someone would want to know the truth about what he knew and when he knew it. He made up his mind to explain what the Willow Run report really meant. Germany hadn't lost because of mistakes in battle, or because they didn't want to win enough, or because the other side's leaders were better. Germany had lost because they just couldn't make as much stuff as the other side. It didn't matter how brave they were or what they believed. Manufacturing numbers don't lie. You can't argue with them, and you can't overcome them with faith. They just are what they are. He decided to say that the Nazi leaders had been told the truth about this, but they had chosen to ignore it. The reports had been filed away and forgotten. The truth had been presented, but they had refused to accept it. By choosing belief over numbers, the administration had doomed everyone, including themselves. He decided to name the people who had made those choices and what their choices had led to. This was defeatism in the Nazis' book. This was treason by any standard the administration could use. Canaris knew this. He wasn't stupid about what would happen to him, but he had realized something else, that trying to stay in the middle for so long had helped the administration more than it had helped the truth. His careful words, his softened conclusions, his professional secrecy, they had all helped create an atmosphere where people could admit uncomfortable facts in private but keep up the lies in public. His choice to speak clearly was a way of fighting back against that atmosphere. It was almost definitely going to get him killed. But Canaris wasn't kidding himself. He knew he wasn't going to survive the war anyway. The only question was what he would do with the time he had left. Would he take his knowledge to the grave, protecting himself even in death by staying silent? Or would he speak, knowing that his words might be ignored, forgotten, or misunderstood, but at least the truth would be out there? In the end, he chose to speak. On April 9, 1945, in the last chaotic weeks of the war, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris was killed at Flossenburg prison camp. They stripped him naked and slowly strangled him with piano wire. It was a horrible, humiliating end for a man who had spent his life trying to live with honor in a horrible, humiliating system. But in his last days, Canaris had chosen being truthful over staying alive. He had chosen to explain the truth about Willow Run, about how much stuff a country could make, about the numbers that led to defeat. He had chosen to say what needed to be said, even though he knew what it would cost him. His death didn't change anything right away. The war would end in a few weeks, no matter what Canaris said or didn't say. The Third Reich would fall. The Nazi leaders would be judged, or escape, or die. History would go on. But the story of Canaris, a man who knew the truth and kept it hidden for a long time, then chose to speak it clearly as he was dying. That story did make a difference. It changed the historical record. It changed how people understood how the Nazi administration worked. It showed that they had accurate information, that the leaders knew better, that the disaster wasn't unavoidable, but a choice they had made. After the war, Canaris's diaries were found. His reports were made public. His coworkers talked about the warnings he had given. It became clear how much he had known and when he had known it. The historical record now shows that Admiral Wilhelm Canaris understood exactly what the Willow Run report meant. He understood it in March 1943, and he never stopped understanding it. The question was never whether he knew. The question was always whether he would speak. And finally, he did. Not soon enough to change what happened, not enough to stop the disaster, but enough so that the truth could never be completely hidden again behind careful words and professional secrecy. This is what Canaris's choice leaves behind. In a time when there's so much information, the most dangerous thing isn't not knowing something. You can always find out what you don't know. The most dangerous thing is knowing something but not doing anything about it. It's acknowledging facts but ignoring them. It's whispering truths in private but denying them in public. This is what happens to groups that care more about staying alive than about being honest, that care more about protecting themselves than about telling the truth. Canaris had been that danger for years, trying to survive in a system that rewarded keeping quiet over telling the truth. But in his last hours, he chose something different. He chose to be a messenger instead of a politician. He chose to be clear instead of careful. He chose to let the truth be heard, even if it cost him everything. The war ended anyway. The administration fell, no matter what he said. But the choice itself, the act of speaking clearly about what he knew, that was important. It always matters, because a society that hides from uncomfortable facts, that keeps truth to private conversations while keeping up comfortable lies in public, that society is doomed, not by enemies from the outside, but by its own refusal to see what's really happening. Canaris understood this in the end, and he chose to speak anyway. By doing so, he became something he had never been during his long career, a man whose honesty finally matched his actions. It cost him his life, but it saved his soul.